Is sin are there different degrees of sin, ? Or is sin a sin no matter what you have done? And then she quotes John 19:11. Jesus answered Pilate by saying, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin.
Obviously, Joel, you answered your own question. Yeah, there are degrees of sin. And God shows that when you go through the Old Testament and you look at the consequences for sin. And so not everything got the death penalty. Certain things that we would be surprised about got the death penalty. And so if you ever lay a hand on your mother or your father in a violent way, it was the death penalty. So you ever push your mom, ever push your dad, ever slap their hand away from you, that got the death penalty in the Old Testament. And if you were a drunkard and you were disobedient to your parents, they could bring you before the judges, and if it was found out to be true, it's like if you're a partier and you're a gang member and you're that kind of person, that got the death penalty. That's why they didn't have a bunch of gangs in ancient Israel. And obviously, murder got the death penalty, adultery got the death penalty. A number of issues got the death penalty, but the other issues didn't. And so if you went and stole something, you had to pay back double or quadruple or up to 7 times, it talks about in the book of Proverbs. And so obviously a different degree of sin in that passage. Let me read to you out of James chapter 2, though. And it says this: if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. And so what James is doing the same thing that Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about sin. So the sin of murder, the cause of murder is anger, and it's uncontrolled anger. The cause of adultery is lust, and it's lust within your heart. And he talks about a couple of other issues in that passage. And what both Jesus and James are going after is a heart that's pure. You want to have a heart that's pure. And so in that instance, God's looking at all sin as being a defilement and something that keeps you separate from God. It doesn't matter what the sin is. It's a breaking of the law. And so James in this passage uses adultery and murder. He could have just as easily used honoring your father and mother and coveting. Or he could have used breaking the Sabbath and stealing, because those are commandments too. And so if you broke the Sabbath or if you stole, it doesn't matter which one it was, you've still broken the commandment of the law. And that's, again, the point is you're a lawbreaker at that point. So being a lawbreaker is universal, but when you're talking about the things that people do, there are obviously different consequences for the kinds of sin that we commit, different consequences physically. And when you're talking about spiritually, giving up the Messiah to death, you're talking about things that are way more radical than just having a lustful heart. You're talking about blasphemy in ways that are just over the top. So Jesus talked about blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. Every sin will be forgiven a man except for the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And that's speaking about the fact that the Holy Spirit points us to Christ. People go to hell for one sin and one sin only, and it's the rejection of Christ. And that's part of what Jesus is talking about in that passage. And when they get to hell, they pay for all the rest of the sin at that point. So
in our conversation on adultery and pornography and stuff is that all sin separates us from God. Mm-hmm. All sin is breaking the commandment of God's law. Mm-hmm. But the degrees and consequences to our actions are going to manifest depending on how intense and different things that we do versus, being angry at my wife versus going and shooting somebody in the face is going to have a whole different aspect of sin and the consequences I get in my life.
Just talk about your wife. I get angry at my wife and then I pull out a gun and shoot her.
Right.
Okay. Getting angry at my wife gets one set of consequences. Pulling out a gun and shooting her gets another whole set of consequences.
I don't know why I didn't go there in my mind. I hesitated. I should have just went with it. Let's end the show with shooting your wife in the face. She's set free.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.